Welcome to your number one source for technological innovations, ideas, and strategies for your business. Multiply your business's equations and put the odds in your favor. Now, live from Club ITHQ with your hosts, Ben and Sam. This is Tech Factor.
Right, everyone. Welcome. I'm Ben, and Sam is on holidays, and this is the Tech Factor. So today we're doing something a little bit different. Actually, well, it's not really different per se. We're going to talk about the recent cybersecurity attacks that essentially were all over the news last week on Friday. So basically, if you aren't living under a rock, what you would have heard was the federal government release do a press release on a range of attacks that they primarily blamed on state actors. In this case, they identified China as one of the sources of this particular attack. However, they were attacks that were done using known exploits, utilizing standard open source systems and effectively copy and paste code. So it wasn't anything particularly targeted per se. It was targeted in the areas that it was targeted to. So it was targeted to very specific organizations. However, the level of sophistication and the way it was done, it wasn't done in a very specific way that you would, for example, normally attribute to a very specific type of targeted state-based attack. So with that said, it was just a broad brush attack. Effectively, it was just use a whole bunch of exploits, run some code that effectively you can get off the internet and see what hits. Now, there was a lot of fuss made about this in the media over the last couple of days, mainly due to the scale of the attack. But there were some talks about if you read some of the bits and pieces in the media, they say, well, what can you do in your own business? And a lot of the references were to the ASD's Essential 8, or it's now under the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, but previously it was the Australian Signals Directorate. And they have what's called the Essentials 8, which is the Essentials 8. It's a technical standard for basically some of the control mechanisms that you can put in place to mitigate against some cybersecurity measures to protect your organisation. Now, in most cases, and most standard types of attacks, these types of measures will mitigate against the majority of effectively what we saw over the last few days, which were what you would almost call like copy and paste attacks, right? Very targeted attacks. There will still be workarounds, and there will still be things that people will ultimately do if they spend enough time learning about the people that work in your organization and basically where the holes are in your network, and eventually someone will get in. And those types of attacks, of all the cybersecurity attacks, it's about 25% of the cybersecurity attacks are targeted attacks of some sort. A highly targeted attacks, maybe it's down to 15%. So effectively, you're mitigating against the old 80-20 rule, right? So you're mitigating against 80% of the security, cybersecurity instances if you implement the Essential 8. Now, what's quite ironic was that, and some of the attacks that were somewhat effective that got through some of the defences in some of the various organisations, government departments, some of the government departments have been found over the years to not even effectively follow the Essential 8, and that's been identified by the government's own auditors. So don't feel bad if you're not completely on top of this, because the reality of it is that the government isn't on top of it either. It goes without no surprises that these types of attacks can still affect the Australian government as well as other organisations as well, because the reality of it is it's quite resource intensive. It requires a cybersecurity plan. It requires a bit of a budget, a bit of time allocated. Requires people to be responsible for specific cyber activities, so have roles and responsibilities in an organisation. It's effectively what we call the ISO 27001 standard, where you've got a management structure around cybersecurity and continuous improvement around cybersecurity, and then you implement your technical standards, such as the Essentials 8. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the Essentials 8, what that really means in a practical sense, And, I guess what these 8 things are that you can do to help improve the cybersecurity in your business. So just a little bit of background. So the essentials is essentially 8 basic strategies or basic implementations of things that you can do to mitigate against cybersecurity instances in your organization. So what the ASD have basically said is, look, if you do these things, it's far more cost effective in times of money than having to actually respond and deal with cybersecurity incidents. So if you can be proactive and you can deal with these issues, it'll make life a lot easier. And so they highly recommend implementing these. And again, it's also you've got to have strategy and you've got to have management behind it as well. So you can't just have your IT department go, this is their responsibility. Cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility. And it's important that, even if you implement this type of thing, that you have a management strategy behind it and an actual management framework for internal audit, continuous improvement, etc. So in saying that, let's get into it. So the first key area that the Essentials 8 covers is basically trying to mitigate against malware delivery and execution. So basically trying to stop stuff from getting onto your network, being delivered, and then being executed on your network. So what does that involve? Well, that really, in the Essentials 8, that involves 4 things. So the first thing, and one of the most common things that most people should be aware of, is patching applications. So what that means basically is what often happens over time is there are updates that come through for your applications, whether that be, for example, your web browser. Macromedia or Adobe Flash used to be one of the common things that people would use to exploit, because Adobe Flash, and now it's not commonly used on websites anymore, but it used to be a big thing. And Adobe Flash had the capability of running all kinds of shell commands, which meant it had direct access to your operating system. So it used to be a major source of vulnerabilities. Fortunately, now most websites don't use Flash, and Flash has been phased out. But things like your web browser, so Google Chrome, Edge, again, exploits happen from time to time. Microsoft Office is another common one where there's lots of exploits that occur. People find ways to, for example, things like Office macros, where a macro can do all these types of automated tasks for you, so in an Excel spreadsheet. But again, it can also access your operating system and do all kinds of other nasty automated things that can cause issues. So really what this is about is, if there's a really bad vulnerability, you need to patch it straight away. Or you need to have, again, someone like a managed service provider, again, like what Club IT does, to keep an eye on those vulnerabilities and to patch them as soon as they possibly can. Generally, so for extreme risk vulnerabilities, they recommend within 48 hours. That's where you've got a piece of malware, for example, that's spreading quite actively, and you need to patch that ASAP. And certainly, we'll definitely recommend that, and that's what the ASD Essential 8 suggests. At the very least, you need to be doing weekly patching for vulnerabilities regardless anyway. And I think no matter the risk of that, I think it's important to do that. So, and the reason for that is, as the Essentials 8 based document basically says, is that security vulnerabilities can be used to execute malicious code on your systems, which is basically just reiterating what I've said. If your software's not up to date, it's possible it could be vulnerable, and that could cause issues or ways for people to get access to your system and do all kinds of naughty things. So make sure your software is up to date. Something that, again, the government itself isn't very good at, but it's something that, as an organisation, if you want to be serious about cybersecurity, you need to stay on top of. The next one I want to talk about is application control. So basically prevent certain applications from doing things they shouldn't do. Now, this one's a little bit technical, and there may be some built-in systems. Again, if you've got a really good security package, it will block a lot of this type of stuff automatically, but you may need some assistance in relation to this one, because it's about sort of blocking, for example, executables or certain scripts to run on your system. Generally speaking, unless you're really familiar with some of this, you'll have trouble implementing this on your own. You may need to seek external advice on the best way to do this. But honestly, in a work environment, the best way to do this is literally just to prevent people from opening executables or installing stuff without the required permissions. So essentially locking your network down so that only an administrator can make changes to your network will mitigate against, it'll go a long way in terms of application control. There are other systems you can put in place that will literally like whitelist applications. So that is another practice you can do, where effectively people can only use a certain applications on your system and everything else is locked down. And it's a great way of doing things as well. A little bit meticulous and can be a little bit hard to manage depending on the IT systems you have in place, but that's another option as well. So that's something there that the ASD recommend. A bit of a technical one, but it is, again, important. And I think probably in the most practical sense, it means that if someone doesn't need to be able to install stuff, leave it to the administrators, get them to manually approve and have permissions for installation, but no one else really should have that access to that. The next one that the ASD talk about is, again, configuring Microsoft Office macro settings. So we talked a little bit about this in patching applications, but essentially you've got to be really careful about macros, because macros can do all kinds of funny things. And look, they are great for automation in an Office, particularly in Outlook and Excel. But the problem is, again, with this type of system, is that again, they can be used to deliver malicious code on a network. So again, making sure that the macros that you use, approved macros, are restricted in their settings. So you can go to the macro settings on whichever macros that you may be utilizing in Office, and making sure they only have permissions to do exactly what they need to do. Again, you may need some external advice for this, and it may be worthwhile doing a review of this within your organization from time to time, just as part of an audit process. So that's the other key factor that the ASD recommend. So on to the next one. They talk about user application hardening. So that's effectively, what that means is, if something doesn't need to really be running, or there doesn't need to be permissions for an application to do something, just get rid of it. So again, in the example that the ASD talk about, they talk about web browsers blocking Flash, or ideally uninstalling it. And again, that's something I mentioned earlier. Flash can be used to execute malicious code. Again, if you've got, for example, computers that are just doing really basic things. So if you've got let's say, just giving you a simple example, let's say you've got a reception PC and it only needs access to, say, one particular application and maybe only a couple of websites. Well, you just block everything else, right? And that's what user application hardening is. You just basically say, right, well, this is all I need access to. We restrict the access to anything else. And if anything else requires access, then, you go through an approval process, IT tidy it up, and they give them access. Java is another thing that you may have heard of. Java. It's not only a coffee, it's also a programming language. Java allows us to do lots of really cool things. So Android operating system is heavily based on Java. All the apps that you use on a daily basis are probably heavily based on Java. And in the web browser technology, again, we heavily rely on Java. Java is an amazing programming language. But again, there are some things we don't necessarily need to be using Java on. And there are some scenarios where you may want to restrict Java's functionality. Again, going back to Microsoft Office and PDF viewers, etc. PDF's a great technology that allows us to do all kinds of things. But also PDF does have the ability to open up links that could potentially be malicious or other bits and pieces as well. So just being smart about that stuff. And really, if it doesn't need to be enabled on the system, just don't enable it. And that's really what user application hardening in a simple sense is all about. And again, it's about mitigating the ability for a malicious payload to actually be executed on the system. So, that's the first half of it. And then really the second half goes to these are about mitigation strategies, right? So these are the types of strategies you can implement to mitigate against cybersecurity instances. So we've already touched on it, but restricting administrative privileges to operating systems and applications based on user duties. Well, technically it should be user roles. So regularly validating the need for privileges. So again, and if they're let's say, for example, the receptionist, they don't need administrative privileges to just read emails and do web browsing, right? So it's about reviewing the security roles within the organization. Again, if we go to the ISO 27001 standard, it talks about role-based access and understanding basically the roles within an organization, and making sure that when users are onboarded or when, for example, someone's changed their role in an organization, those permissions are regularly reviewed. So making sure you've got systems in place to mitigate against that type of stuff. So I guess in a simple terms and really in a practical thing of what you can do at an organization level, it's really just about limiting administrative access where it doesn't need to be provided. And again, you don't want administrative access on your reception PC, a computer right at the front, or, computers that are exposed to the public, for example, computers that people can easily get access to. Again, these are the types of systems that we want to lock down and really limit the administrative privileges to. So really limit administrative privileges to only where it's needed and to only the minimum number of accounts. The less people that have administrative access, the better for your network. So the other one we talked about, we've touched on it already, patching operating systems. So again, we talked about applications, but operating systems is the other one as well. So with operating systems, again, we're seeing vulnerabilities come through all the time, not just with Windows, but also with Mac OS and with Linux from time to time, or Linux, however you like to call it. So again, it's important that you have systems in place to automatically update Windows. Windows 10 actually is really good with this. It's a little bit, it's good and bad depending on whose angle you look at it from. But the great thing about Windows 10 is it is very aggressive in its patching capabilities. Sometimes probably to the point of it might be inconvenient for some users. And again, if you're finding you're having trouble keeping up with your patching, you're talking to someone like Club IT, we can certainly help with that. We have automated systems that allow us to monitor and manage that stuff. There are systems that you can look at on the internet as well that can assist with this type of thing as well. But keeping your operating system up to date, really critical. It's the first port of call when someone tries to get access to your network. And security vulnerabilities on operating system are, they're open keys to the network. Maybe not everyone has Adobe Acrobat installed, but everyone is running, for example, Windows or Mac OS or something. So making sure that your operating system is kept up to date is really important, and it's one of the most basic things that they talk about in the Essentials 8 standard. So the other one, which is literally, I would say, a requirement these days, is multi-factor authentication, MFA or 2FA, whatever you'd like to call it. Essentially, anything that is used, anything you access remotely should have multi-factor authentication on it, ideally. So not even ideally, it's literally required these days, to be frank. So things like VPNs, RDP, which if we talk about the Total IPEC example, I guarantee there wouldn't have been two-factor on that. SSH. So SSH is basically a system mainly in the Unix environment where you can log into a server and do commands and do bits and pieces. But anything where you can, look, in a simple sense, if you access it remotely or if you access from the cloud, it really should have two-factor on it. And that will mitigate against a large majority of automated cybersecurity instances. So if you can implement multi-factor authentication on all the areas where you've got remote access, that's a really good start. I would say it's probably, of all the things that you can do, particularly in the Essentials 8 standard, I would say that's probably the most important these days in terms of mitigating against the most automated attacks. Now, what you can do, again, if we look at, say, RDP, so that's remote desktop protocol, or RDS, it's also called remote desktop services, is the platform you can use to remote into a server, and you can have your Windows experience, your start menu, and all your applications in that. Again, there's systems like Duo Security, for example, that offer two-factor authentication. There's a whole range of platforms out there. But what you should do is you should look at all the things that you access remotely and go, okay, how can I enable two-factor on that? So if it's Google G Suite, for example, or Office 365, they have those functionality built in. All you've really got to do is, Google literally, do a search engine, how to enable two-factor on Office 365 or on G Suite. It's very simple, very easy to do. But have a look at all the applications that you use remotely and look at two-factor or multi-factor solutions for those. Really important part of the standard, and that's one of the things that they recommend as the Essentials 8. The last one that I want to talk about, and it's an interesting one, so it's about mitigation strategies to recover data and system availability. So again, this is a little bit once the horse is bolted, right? It's extremely important. It's still, don't get me wrong, backups is one of the most important ABCs of good IT practice. But in the case of a major cybersecurity incident, if you're relying on backups, you're probably already at the point where some of the worst damage has already occurred. So what they say in the Essentials 8, and I'll read it verbatim, is daily backups of important new change data, software, and configuration scenes stored, disconnected, retained for at least 3 months, test restoration initially, annually, and when IT infrastructure changes. It says why? To ensure information can be accessed following a cybersecurity incident. So once an incident occurs or after the fact, make sure you can still get your systems back up. I mean, that's essentially what it's saying. The problem is now, and again, this is where maybe the standard may need to be updated at some point, but it's still, look, daily backups are still extremely important. But what we're seeing now is what we've reported previously on at the Tech Factor is things like the Maze ransomware, for example, where they don't care whether you're, they won't bother encrypting your data. They'll just take your data and they'll hold your data to ransom, but not in the traditional way that, if you don't give us money, we won't give you back your data. They'll publish your data to the internet via the dark web for all to see. So that's the new way of ransomware attacks. The thing about that type of attack is that it doesn't matter how many copies of your server data or whatever you might have. In those instances, they're going to publish your data if you don't pay the ransom, no matter what. So it doesn't matter that you've got a copy of your data because they've got a copy too, and they're more focused on doing malicious damage via publishing that information on the dark web. Creates a whole bunch of issues, not only reputational damage, but massive security damage for your clients, your customers. It's a whole whirlwind of problems. And that's what we're now starting to see in terms of ransomware. So while daily backups extremely important, and again, the Essentials 8 standard suggests that you should retain key data for at least 3 months. And again, it says you need to test initially, annually, and also when the IT infrastructure changes. Again, 100% agree with that. But don't assume that backups or regular backups alone are a good cybersecurity strategy on their own. They're now, I would suggest, a very small part of the picture, lesser part of the picture than what they were before. So in terms of good IT practice, absolutely, you've got to have your backups in place. Not just, forget about cybersecurity for a minute. Statistically speaking, the vast majority of basically data loss occurs not through cybersecurity instances, but it occurs through human error. So, of course, regardless of how good of cybersecurity measures you have in place, human error is what's going to ultimately cause issues with your data, and that's going to be where you're going to need your backups. So, good practice, good IT practice, putting aside cybersecurity, have your daily backups. Make sure you have your data retention policies. Now, you may not necessarily need to retain all of your data for 3 months. I would suggest it says important new or changed data or software and configuration scenes. So what it's saying is the stuff that basically is operational to the business, you should really keep that for as long as you possibly can. It says ideally around 3 months. There may be some data that, again, you might not necessarily need to be backing up every single thing for at least 3 months. So, again, that may be excessive in some circumstances. It depends on the organisation, and certainly if you're a mid-sized organisation, I'd be recommending it anyway because the price of storage is fairly cheap these days. It's a fairly easy thing to implement. But again, your data loss is typically going to come through human error. It's not going to come generally now through cybersecurity. And if it's coming regularly through cybersecurity instances, you've got a far bigger problem because it means that all of the other things that we've discussed haven't been sufficiently covered. And that, my friends, is the Essentials 8. So that is what the ASD call the Essentials 8. It is a really good technical standard and advice for what you should be doing in terms of mitigating against your cybersecurity exposure. And that's the other thing I want to talk about very briefly before we finish up. Cybersecurity insurance isn't a cybersecurity measure in terms of mitigating against cybersecurity instances. And what we're now starting to see, I just want to make this point because some people might go, oh, well, I've got cybersecurity insurance. It doesn't really matter if I implement any strategies or not, or if I do anything useful. I don't need to do patching because I've got cybersecurity insurance. They'll just cover it. What we're starting to see now is the cybersecurity insurance won't necessarily cover you if you're not taking sufficient cybersecurity measures to mitigate against cybersecurity in your business. So what you may eventually find with your cybersecurity insurance is that you won't be covered unless you are doing these types of basics. And again, it depends on the size and scale of the business and various circumstances and the insurance you have. But it's something to really keep in mind that having cybersecurity insurance does not guarantee that you will be covered or you'll be able to mitigate against cybersecurity instances, at least financially, if you aren't doing all the right things in the first place. Again, it's becoming a very complicated area, and there's a lot of law developing around cybersecurity insurance. And, again, the insurance companies, they want to make money. And if cybersecurity instances are increasing and, they're going to have to increase the premiums and they're going to have to tighten the controls in order to make sure that they make their income as well from the risk. So something else to keep in mind is that cybersecurity insurance is not a cybersecurity mitigation solution, and it doesn't talk about that in the standard because, again, it's not a technical, it's not a technical mitigation strategy. It's something sure you need to have, but again, you need to be implementing the right cybersecurity measures if you want to be sufficiently covered by your cybersecurity insurance. So that's the Essentials 8. It's a really important standard, great standard, something that you should be considering for your business. Again, if you need help implementing that, companies like ourselves at Club IT, we can do all those types of things. We've got a range of systems in place to basically deal with these types of measures that you can put in place. The other thing I just want to touch on, so again, it is a technical standard. Some of these things you may be able to very easily implement by yourself just by doing a little bit of Googling. Other things you may require a specialist. But the other thing as well, you've really got to make sure this doesn't come just from your IT. So if you're an IT department and you're listening to this, it's great that you're listening to this and it's great that you can maybe implement some of these things, but make sure you get management on board as well. You've got to get management on board. It's got to be a whole organization responsibility. And that's really what this is all about. And when you look at the government departments, for example, that maybe don't have some of these things in place, that has been exposed before by the auditor at a national level, again, that comes down to making sure that everyone is on the same page in terms of cybersecurity. And maybe, and I'm just hypothesizing, but again, with large organizations, whether it is government level or whether it is, say, an ASX listed company, they have departments and they go, well, that's IT's responsibility or that's their responsibility. Cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility. Can't stress that enough. So while you can put these measures in place, it's important you also have the management systems in place that support it and the training and awareness across an entire organization that understands the importance of cybersecurity. So that is the tech factor. So I'm Ben. That was the tech factor. That is the ASD Essentials 8 cybersecurity. And we will see you guys next time.